From the CIA running secret torture sites to the FBI covering up the truth behind a mysterious plane crash, these aren't just wild conspiracy theories, they actually happened. And we're starting with number 14, Operation Popeye and weather warfare in Vietnam. Weather control conspiracy theories have been around forever. Someone, somewhere manipulating the skies. But what if they aren't so crazy after all? During the Vietnam War, the US actually tried to turn the weather into a weapon. The geoengineering project was called Operation Popeye, and it was a 5-year effort to make life hell for the Viet Cong. The idea was simple: seed the skies with clouds to make Vietnam's monsoon season last even longer. The theory was simple: more rain would turn Vietnam's dirt roads into impassable mud, crippling the Viet Cong supply lines. If it worked, it could destabilize the enemy and bring the US one step closer to victory. Of course, the US denied it ever happened. The Nixon administration lied and denied at every turn. Not even Congress managed to get the truth out of Tricky Dicky. It was only when Operation Popeye documents were declassified in 1974 that the truth actually came out. The US had run over 2,600 cloud-seeding sorties, trying to implant silver and lead iodide into the skies. Operation Popeye remains one of the few known cases of hostile geoengineering. And the worst part? It failed miserably. The US didn't win in Vietnam, and the extra rain, if it even worked, did nothing to stop the Viet Cong. Still, at least the US was attacking an enemy as part of that conspiracy. Just a few years earlier, it had turned its airborne operations on its own people with number 13, Operation LAC, or Large Area Coverage. It was the 1950s and the US was locked in a Cold War standoff with the Soviet Union. Uncle Sam needed to be ready for anything, including the possibility of using chemical attacks against Russian cities. There was just one problem: the US couldn't access those cities for testing, and launching an attack would risk turning the Cold War into an all-out war. So what did the government do? Well, it tested chemical weapons on its own citizens. Between 1957 and 1958, the U.S. Army Chemical Corps worked alongside the U.S. Air Force to spray microscopic zinc-cadmium sulfide particles over several American cities. The military used a C-119 flying boxcar to release tons of dangerous material into the atmosphere. The first test took place on December 2, 1957, covering a path from South Dakota to International Falls, Minnesota. Zinc-cadmium sulfide is no joke. Long-term exposure to the chemical can cause serious problems, including kidney impairment, bone weakness, and chronic inflammation of the respiratory tract. In other words, the U.S. was dousing its own people with a chemical that made them weaker and caused breathing problems. That would be bad enough. However, it later turned out that the military used even more than just planes in Operation LAC. Blowers on top of high-rise buildings, in schools, and even positioned in station wagons spread the dangerous chemicals closer to the ground. In St. Louis, which was one of the test areas, the government focused on low-income and predominantly black areas with those tests. At the time, local officials assured residents the military was simply testing a smokescreen to protect cities in the event of a Russian attack. But in 1994, the truth came out. Operation LAC wasn't about defense at all. It was a biological weapons program, and the cities chosen for testing weren't random. They were selected because they resembled potential Russian targets. There's anecdotal evidence that Operation LAC had deadly consequences. St. Louis resident Doris Spates lost 4 siblings to cancer. She also lost her father when she was just a baby in 1995, and battled cervical cancer herself. Could the U.S. government's decision to spray its own citizens with dangerous chemicals be to blame? Perhaps we'll never know. And Operation LAC wasn't the only time the U.S. conducted secret chemical weapons tests, which brings us to number 12, Project 112 and Shad, or Shipboard Hazard and Defense. During the Cold War, the U.S. launched Project 112, a top-secret program designed to test chemical and biological weapons. Running from 1962 to 1973, it studied how these agents behaved under different conditions on land and at sea. And that leads us to Project Shad. According to the Department of Veteran Affairs, this branch of Project 112 involved approximately 6,000 American service members, primarily from the Navy and the Army, with some from the Marines and Air Force, conducting chemical tests under the guise of defense research. So, where is the conspiracy? Not all of the 6,000 or so who took part in Project Shad knew that they were involved in the chemical tests. They were essentially used as human samples, with the situation made even worse by the Department of Defense's long-standing secrecy. Documents related to the tests were deliberately withheld from the public for years, and even today, much of what happened remains shrouded in mystery. Retired Navy officer Jack Alderson blew the whistle on the fact that many service members involved in Project Shad had no idea they were being exposed to chemical or biological weapons aboard their own ships. He also accused the U.S. military of bombarding him and his colleagues with chemical agents and harsh decontamination products. Alderson took his case all the way to Congress, arguing that these tests led to long-term health issues, including a higher-than-normal cancer rate among the 6,000 service members involved. In response, the Institute of Medicine of the National Academies launched several studies to investigate the claims. However, the first report, released in 2007, found no definitive link between Project Shad and long-term health effects. The fact that the U.S. tested chemical and biological weapons on its own soldiers without telling all of them what was happening is enough. Of course, it's not just the American government that's involved in shady schemes and cover-ups. Our next entry involves what was once one of the biggest airlines the U.S. had ever seen. Number 11. The TWA Flight 800 cover-up. On the evening of July 17, 1996, TWA Flight 800 took off from New York City en route to Paris. It wouldn't come close to reaching France. Just 8 miles off the coast of Long Island, the jumbo jet completely broke down in the air, killing all 230 passengers. The National Transportation Safety Board, or NTSB, naturally launched an investigation. Over the next 4 years, it pored over every aspect of the accident, eventually coming to the conclusion that TWA Flight 800 broke up due to its center wing fuel tank exploding. However, that explanation wasn't enough for some. The NTSB never figured out the real cause of the explosion, suggesting that it may have had something to do with the short-circuiting of wiring outside of the fuel tank. But it wasn't long before the NTSB investigation was called into question. Broadcast journalist Christina Borjesson teamed up with the physicist and film producer Tom Stalkup to dig deeper into the crash. They claimed that the FBI got involved in the investigation early on, mishandling the wreckage to hamper the NTSB. Other claims suggested that the FBI detected explosive residue, including nitroglycerin, on some of the aircraft parts sent in for testing. However, the NTSB dismissed the findings, stating there were no clear patterns in the results. However, far more damning are the eyewitness reports. Of the 258 people who saw the plane break up, almost 183 claimed that they saw a streak of light fly toward the aircraft before it exploded. Some described that streak as a trio of fast-moving missile-like objects that flew through the sky and impacted the plane. In 2000, the NTSB ruled out the possibility of a missile strike, stating that after 4 years of analyzing every piece of wreckage, no such evidence was found. But not everyone is convinced, and Stalkup isn't convinced. There's enough in the public domain now for any scientist to conclude that the official theory is wrong, he claims. As for TWA, the airline stayed silent. Then just a year after the NTSB released its findings, TWA, once one of America's top airlines, shut down for good, ending its 76-year legacy in bankruptcy. These are all crazy conspiracies so far. There are more coming, starting with another scandal involving an airline. Wait, did we say an airline? Try at least 21 of them. Number 10. The Penny Planes price-fixing scandal. The 2000s wasn't a great time for the world's major airlines. Many of them were operating at steep losses, collectively losing billions of dollars per year. 2004 saw combined losses of $5.6 billion across the industry, with 2005 not being much better. $4.1 billion was lost in that year. But around 2010, profits really picked up, hitting $17.3 billion for the year. Pre-COVID, airlines were raking in the money. One of the reasons is that the airlines came up with a sneaky little trick to make up for their lost profits during the decade before. When facing potential financial ruin, airline executives the world over got together and developed a scheme to artificially inflate prices without consumers or the authorities ever knowing. They did it by creating a price-fixing scheme they applied to cargo and fuel surcharges, adding a few dollars of profit here and there to every flight they ran. And to make sure the gravy train kept rolling, those airlines colluded on these fees, ensuring no one ever charged less than the others, so passengers had no choice but to pay up. The scheme ran from 2000 to 2006, but the executive's downfall began in 2005, when officials at the German airline Lufthansa alerted the U.S. Justice Department that their own company had been involved in illegal surcharges. An investigation followed, and on Valentine's Day 2006, the FBI and its European counterparts made their findings public, with a series of high-profile raids on the offices of the impacted airlines. Not exactly the kind of romantic surprise the shady executives were hoping for. After the raids, Virgin Atlantic joined Lufthansa in admitting its role in the price-fixing scandal. Other airlines, including British Airways and Korean Air, kept quiet. In the 5 years after those raids, 19 airline executives were charged with some form of wrongdoing, with 4 of those executives going to prison. Massive criminal antitrust fines were also handed out, with 21 airlines paying over $1.7 billion for their roles in the affair. Interestingly, not every airline that was invited to join the massive conspiracy signed up. Executives from United Airlines and Northwest Airlines, both US-based carriers, left a 2004 meeting when talk of price fixing came up. However, they never spoke up. Nobody did until Lufthansa officials whistle blew on themselves. In the absence of someone coming forward and ratting it out, it is very difficult to establish that there was a conspiracy, said San Francisco lawyer Christopher Lebsack. If it wasn't for the guilty consciences of some German officials, we might still all be paying more than we should to fly. Still, at least those airlines weren't selling water-containing poo. That's more than we can say for the perpetrators of our next conspiracy. Number 9. Nestlé's water extraction controversy. Nestlé and water don't really mix. For most of the 2010s, the company spent a lot of time and far less money than it should gaining access to spring water sites. It did it by either applying for licenses to access those sites itself or buying smaller companies that it then used to extract the water. Licenses were cheap and easy to come by. An application to pump groundwater could be bought for as little as $2,100 per year, allowing Nestlé to essentially control many of America's natural water resources for profit. And profit it did. In 2018, Nestlé turned a massive profit, $5.4 billion in U.S. bottled water sales and $7.8 billion globally, extracting water that should have been free for all, bottling it in plastic and then selling it for a premium. But that same year, reports of Nestlé's environmental damage began surfacing. The company was siphoning so much water from licensed sites that creeks and springs were running dry. In some cases, Nestlé was even drawing water illegally. One example was Strawberry Creek, where in 2017 the company was ordered to immediately cease any unauthorized diversions. Nestlé's tactics were classified as predatory, with the company doing tons of damage to natural resources, all in the name of profit. Beyond extracting water it had no right to, Nestlé spent decades using illegal filtering methods on its so-called natural water without consumers ever knowing. The deception only came to light when European investigators discovered that several of Nestlé's mineral water sources in France were contaminated with E. coli, pesticides, and even feces, all due to the company's unauthorized filtering practices. Yet, Nestlé still marketed this as natural mineral water, adding food fraud to its growing list of scandals. In January 2024, the company finally admitted to illegally treating its bottled water. 3 years earlier, Nestlé Waters North America was sold to a private equity firm and rebranded as Blue Triton. But scandals have a way of catching up. After years of deception and controversy, Nestlé's water empire collapsed, forcing it out of the game for good. Speaking of water, environmental issues, and France, all three came together in our next crazy conspiracy. Number 8. The Rainbow Warrior sinking. In July 1985, the Rainbow Warrior, a Greenpeace-owned vessel, was docked in Auckland, New Zealand. Its crew was preparing for a 3,000-mile journey into the South Pacific, where they planned to disrupt a French nuclear test at Mururoa Atoll. But the Rainbow Warrior would never leave the docks. On the night of July 10th, a sudden explosion rocked the Rainbow Warrior, jolting the crew awake. Skipper Peter Wilcox rushed to the engine room only to find water flooding in, already 2 to 3 feet deep. Realizing the danger, he immediately ordered the crew to evacuate. Just 7 minutes later, a second explosion tore through the ship. The Rainbow Warrior was left half-sunken in the Auckland dock. But the worst tragedy had already unfolded. Portuguese photographer Fernando Pereira never made it out. He drowned in his cabin. It was later revealed that the Rainbow Warrior was sunk by France in an operation codenamed Opération Satanique. The attack, orchestrated by France's intelligence agency, the Directorate General for External Security, was meant to be a covert mission. Instead, it was an unmistakable act of state-sponsored terrorism. But the operation quickly unraveled. The 2 French agents who planted the bombs were caught in New Zealand and charged with willful damage, arson, conspiracy to commit arson, and murder. Despite the mounting evidence, France initially denied any involvement. But with its agents caught, France had no choice but to come clean. Prime Minister Laurent Fabius was forced to admit responsibility, and the scandal led to the resignation of Defense Minister Charles Ernoult. The 2 captured French agents were sentenced to 10 years in prison, but in a final insult to Rainbow Warrior's crew, those agents were quietly sent back home just 2 years into their sentence, thanks to broken diplomatic promises by France. Still, at least France apologized and paid reparations to New Zealand, Greenpeace, and the unfortunate Pereira's family. France isn't the only country to poke its nose where it doesn't belong. The US has a long history of doing the same, as we saw with Number 7. The CIA's role in Chile's 1973 coup. Between 1963 and 73, the United States was deeply entangled in Chilean politics. In 1964, the CIA poured $3 million, equivalent to $30.3 million today, into influencing Chile's presidential election. But it failed. Self-proclaimed Marxist Salvador Allende still won, and Washington wasn't pleased. Allende's plans to nationalize U.S.-owned copper companies made him a major threat in American eyes. Determined to stop him, the U.S. doubled down, spending another $8 million, now worth $80.9 million between 1970 and 1973, to remove him from power. Once again, Allende held on, but the U.S. had one ace up its sleeve. Chile was deeply polarized, and Allende didn't have the military on his side. That gave the CIA the perfect opening to collaborate with the Chilean military to remove Allende once and for all. The agency funded and advised a brutal coup led by General Augusto Pinochet, unleashing a wave of mass arrests. Thousands were detained in massive facilities, including the infamous Estadio Nacional Stadium, where many were tortured and executed. In the end, Pinochet seized control of Chile, turning the country into a military dictatorship. Under Pinochet's brutal 17-year rule, 3,000 people were killed or disappeared, while another 38,000 were imprisoned and tortured. Meanwhile, the U.S. government's role in the coup was exposed by the New York Times journalist Seymour Hersh, who revealed that the CIA had actively assisted Pinochet in overthrowing Allende. Rather than distancing itself, the U.S. doubled down. President Richard Nixon, again, increased bilateral aid to Chile, all but confirming America's financial backing of the regime change. But one positive outcome did emerge. In response, Congress, led by Senator Ted Kennedy, introduced amendments to cut off aid, giving lawmakers greater oversight on where U.S. financial support was sent and how it was used. Speaking of money, our next crazy conspiracy is all about how a bunch of rich oil executives spent decades denying climate change to line their pockets. Number 6. Big Oil's climate change cover-up. For nearly a century, America's oil giants raked in massive profits, virtually unchecked. The world ran on oil, and they were the ones supplying it. And if that meant fueling climate disasters, rising sea levels, devastating mega rains in the Midwest, and the collapse of entire fishing communities, so be it. And Big Oil made sure nothing stood in the way of their profits. By 2024, at least 26 lawsuits had been filed by American cities and states, all accusing Big Oil of the same crime: deliberately deceiving the public while suppressing warnings about climate change. The industry went so far as to bury the findings of its own scientists when they failed to align with its agenda. Big Oil even commissioned studies to prove its products weren't harming the environment. But when the results didn't go its way, the data was locked away for decades, all to keep the money flowing. And the American public was duped. Big Oil's deception didn't just cost the planet, it cost nearly every U.S. state billions in damages from health crises and environmental destruction. California's 2023 lawsuit against these corporate giants laid it all out, accusing them of lying to protect profits while pushing green and low-emissions products that still contributed to carbon pollution. We should not have to foot the bill alone while oil companies profit, the state declared in a press release. And California wasn't alone. 5 years later, Greenpeace exposed ExxonMobil, one of America's biggest energy firms, secretly lobbying against climate action while publicly claiming to support it. The industry's playbook was clear: say one thing, do another, and then cash in. ExxonMobil branded the claims as disturbing and inaccurate at the time. Its entanglement in today's Big Oil lawsuits makes one thing clear: ExxonMobil knew exactly what it was doing. It likely lied, manipulated, and covered up the truth, all to make the rich even richer. And what Big Oil is doing isn't the only example of mass manipulation on our list. There's also number 5, Operation Mockingbird. Cold War paranoia gave the CIA all the justification it needed to launch a massive media manipulation campaign. The goal was to flood America's news outlets with propaganda while gathering intelligence on the side, ensuring the public never felt an ounce of sympathy for the communist nations the U.S. opposed. That campaign was called Operation Mockingbird. The CIA routinely bribed mainstream media outlets and journalists to publish narratives that favored America while vilifying its enemies. It was essentially a massive media recruitment program, one where those hired only ever told the U.S.-approved side of the story. Evidence of this covert media operation first surfaced in 1967 when Ramparts magazine exposed the CIA's funding of the National Student Association, a group that acted as a front for the U.S. government. More revelations followed in 1975, when the Church Committee's congressional investigations uncovered deep CIA ties to prominent journalists and organizations. But the biggest bombshell came in 1977, when investigative journalist Carl Bernstein blew the lid off the entire operation. His reporting revealed that the CIA wasn't just paying for favorable coverage, it was fabricating news through its front groups. Under mounting pressure, the agency was forced to admit it had paid at least 400 journalists and 25 major organizations, both in the US and abroad, to plant propaganda and manipulate public perception, all to manipulate the public into believing that the US is always right. How about we move away from the US for a little bit? After all, it's not just the US that's been involved in conspiracies, with South Africa almost mimicking Project Shad with its own covert operation. Number 4. Project Coast, South Africa's chemical and biological warfare program. In 1981, South Africa created a chemical and biological weapons program dubbed Project Coast. The program ran for 14 years and was supposedly created to allow the country to develop better chemical crowd control agents along with defensive gear for its soldiers, only that is not what the project did. The 1980s saw apartheid South Africa at its peak, and Project Coast provided the perfect cover for the white-led government to develop deadly weapons against its enemies. Most of the program focused on creating poisons designed for targeted assassinations. These included mass-produced MDMA and methaqualone, genetically modified E. coli strains, and even venom extracted from black mamba snakes. Project Coast was nothing if not creative. Project Coast took an even darker turn, as revealed by Don Goosen, the former managing director of Roodeplaat Research Laboratories and a key participant in the program. According to Goosen, his labs conducted research between 1983 and 1986 aimed at reducing the birth rate among South Africa's black population. Proposed methods included a vaccine that could secretly sterilize black men. But Goosen's involvement didn't end there. After the project was exposed, he attempted to sell bacterial stock developed under Project Coast to the FBI in 2002. U.S. officials declined, not for ethical reasons, but because Goosen's asking price was $5 million and immigration permits for himself, his associates, and his family. South Africa went to great lengths to hide what it was doing too. Rather than having any official military or governmental contracts, Project Coast functioned using front companies, making it easier to conduct the illegal transactions needed to keep the operation running. Project Coast was essentially the apartheid-era South African government's attempt to create a countrywide genocide. Thankfully, it failed. We can't say the same for our next crazy conspiracy. Number 3. Russian active measures beyond election interference. The US isn't the only country that's tried to meddle in other nations' elections. Russia is just as guilty of the same crime, and it's often had more success than America did in Chile. In fact, it has an entire catalog of election interference to pull from. The obvious starting point is the United States. During the 2016 presidential elections, Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered an influence campaign that targeted figures like Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, and even the Black Lives Matter movement. Russian intelligence agents posed as American citizens online, deploying an army of bots to spread disinformation and sow division. Putin used the same tactics in Ukraine before launching his special military operation in February 2022. In the lead-up to the invasion, Russian propaganda flooded Ukraine's elections, branding the country as a failed neo-Nazi state run by fascists. It was all designed to convince Ukrainians that independence was a mistake and that their future belonged under Russia's control once again. And the examples keep on coming. In 2024, Moldova voted on whether to join the European Union. Lithuania's foreign minister accused Russia of buying votes and launching disinformation campaigns to sway the outcome. Moldova's pro-European president, Maia Sandu, echoed those claims, alleging that criminal groups working alongside foreign forces, a clear nod to Russia, were actively trying to manipulate the referendum. During the Netherlands' March 2017 general elections, Russia attempted to spread disinformation via social media to sway the results. However, Dutch officials, having studied Russian interference in the 2016 US elections, were able to thwart that effort. France wasn't so lucky. That same year, President Emmanuel Macron reported that his team had been targeted by Russian operatives who created fake Facebook profiles posing as his acquaintances. These accounts were used to infiltrate his inner circle and extract sensitive information from his allies. The UK's 2017 snap election was no exception, facing over 34,000 potential cyber attacks, including 188 high-level breaches between November 2016 and January 2017. And this was just the tip of the iceberg. At this point, calling Russian election interference a conspiracy feels like an understatement. It is happening everywhere. But sometimes we don't need Russia to subvert democracy. Our next crazy conspiracy shows that the US is plenty capable of trying to do that to itself. Number 2. The business plot. In 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or FDR, took office as president, inheriting a nation still reeling from the 1929 stock market crash, With unemployment nearing 15 million, FDR had a plan to solve these issues. He'd campaigned on a promise to provide jobs for all of America's unemployed. But there was a problem. America's business elites despised FDR. To them, his policies reeked of socialism, so they came up with a plan to create a fascist veterans organization that they could use to overthrow FDR and turn the US into a corporate-friendly dictatorship. This conspiracy became known as the Business Plot, or the Wall Street Putsch. The plotters chose the Marine Corps Major General Smedley Butler, a decorated World War I hero, to lead their fabricated veterans organization. Butler later exposed the entire scheme in a 1934 meeting with the U.S. House of Representatives Special Committee on Un-American Activities. The Wall Street Fat Cats pledged $30 million and weapons from Remington Arms to help Butler raise a 500,000-strong private army. They planned to storm the White House, remove FDR, eliminate his entire line of succession, and install Butler as a puppet dictator under their control. But it never happened. Butler's conscience won out. Instead of leading the coup, he reported the conspiracy directly to FDR. Yet, despite the exposure, none of the conspirators ever faced justice. Nearly a century later, the business plot remains a chilling example of how close America came to a corporate-backed dictatorship, only to have history quietly brush it aside. And with that, we come to our last insane conspiracy that turned out to be true. Number 1. The CIA's secret torture sites. For decades, the CIA has operated secret black sites, hidden facilities where enemies of the state are taken and tortured within an inch of their lives, all in the name of intelligence gathering. These sites sound like something out of a movie, but they are terrifyingly real. According to Amnesty International, evidence suggests these sites exist in at least 20 locations worldwide. Many aren't even in the US. The CIA has reportedly run black sites in Kosovo, Poland, Romania, Thailand, Lithuania, and more. To conceal American involvement, the agency uses secret flight plans and privately chartered aircraft, ensuring that when and how its prisoners are transported remains a mystery. The torture inside these black sites is nothing short of horrifying. In 2017, The Guardian reported on a lawsuit that forced the CIA to declassify documents detailing the brutal conditions detainees faced. Prisoners often are stripped down to diapers or, if none were available, wrapped up in duct tape, and were subjected to sleep deprivation for up to 48 hours. They were forced into freezing cold showers while already suffering from exposure and given only the bare minimum of food and water to survive. All of it carried out in the name of justice. Which of these conspiracy theories shocked you the most? Do you think there are even bigger cover-ups still hidden from the public? Let us know in the comments. Now go check out 50 insane declassified FBI secrets you didn't know, or click on this video instead.